I've really been looking forward to this. I really have. I really have. Because there is something about the Tower of Babel that just draws me into it. I don't know what it is. I really don't know what it is. But there's just something so interesting about the Tower of Babel. So I'll be honest, I've been wanting to do this for a long time. And now we finally get to do it. So I'm just going to waste no time. Thank you. Thanks for joining. This video is going to be an interesting one, so I pray that you're edified by it. And I hope that you enjoy it. It's not going to be a long one too, so you don't have to worry about that. Waste no time, let's just jump straight into it. The Tower of Babel. When humans try to create paradise. And you know what? We're going to start this off a little unorthodox by our standards. I'm just going to read it to you. I'm just going to read you the Tower of Babel because it's so short. It's only 9 verses long. Chapter 11. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar. And they dwelt there, and they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they began to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. That's it. That's it. That's it. So let's dive into this because there's so much there for something so small. That's why I love it. So for context, Ham saw his father naked, and Canaan's generations were cursed. So now the godless nations have been birthed, and within those nations was a giant called Nimrod. And he wanted to overthrow God. So he ordained, is that the right word? He instructed the construction of the Tower of Babel. It was a rebellion against God. So let's start off with a question. This is a relatively simple story. Nimrod, a giant, decides to rebel against God by ordering the construction of a tower that will reach up to heaven, but God confused everyone, which results in the construction of the tower being stopped. So when it comes to the Tower of Babel, there's one thing I want to try and answer, and that's why was Nimrod let off so easily? Because when you look at it at first glance, he got off easily. We can look back at the other stories and the people who did wrong, and how God was so merciful, yet so terrible, which shows us that God is just. Take Adam and Eve. They went against God, and now everyone who ever existed, is existing, and will exist is cursed just because of what they did. That's a pretty serious thing. If the actions of two people have such a rippling effect that they affect everyone throughout history, then take Cain. Cain killed his own brother, and he was exiled. And then you have the daughters of men who were utterly destroyed by the flood for what they did. When you compare them to Nimrod, you almost feel, be quiet, stomach, you almost feel compelled to use the word lucky. Because what he did was such a serious thing, yet his punishment was confusion. So one of the main questions I want to answer today is, how did the punishment fit the crime? Let's start off with what the tower represents. The story of the Tower of Babel juxtaposes the flood. The flood was God, the Most High, from above. He brought destruction to that which was below him for the greater good. Here you have the humans, which is below God, trying to build their way up to heaven. This time, that which is below is attempting to merge the realms the same way God did with the flood. The building of the tower was a rebellion against God. God had said to go forth throughout the earth and multiply, but the people who built the tower stayed in one place and built the tower in an attempt to transcend their level of being. This is why it was a prideful rebellion. They were trying to be their own gods. In the eyes of Nimrod, God wasn't needed. So they decided to do things themselves, which tells us that the Tower of Babel is also a parallel to Mount Sinai. Because if Mount Sinai is a hierarchy structure, with that at the top, governing and leading that at the bottom, then the Tower of Babel is that at the bottom trying to climb to the top of the hierarchy by dictating the rules and trying to be that which sits on the top. With all this in mind, it's being pointed at that the Tower of Babel was the first totalitarian state, which would make Nimrod the first tyrant. But to understand how, we're going to have to look at some examples of history, of speech, and how totalitarian states work. What is speech? You might be asking, why the heck are you bothering with that? What's the point of that? Why bother with the history of speech? And to answer that, it's because the first thing we are told about the Tower of Babel is that everyone was of one speech. So that tells us that speech is the center ground for this society. Everything was built upon speech. So what do we know about speech? Because speech isn't obvious. The idea that you can formulate ideas in the mind, from simple ideas to a verbalized format structure, isn't obvious. I think the best place to start is Proverbs 18:21, where it says that death and life are in the power of the tongue. And not only is that true with God, but with us too, because we are made in his image. If we look at the creation story, we are told that God brought life into existence with his words. And with the flood, he spoke death, and it was brought forth. So this tells us that words have meaning. And the intention of those words, in which they are used, structure the reality around you. We spoke about this in the story of Cain and Abel. The thing you believe in most is what governs how you perceive the world around you. Those beliefs that exist as thoughts become verbalized. Those words are spoken. Those words become actions as well as emotions, and they feed the beliefs. It's a vicious cycle. For example, someone who only knows self-hatred will go deaf if they were to hear any kind of talk regarding self-love. Those words, those forms of belief, structured in verbal format, do not align with the belief. They do not appease the God, so to speak. So the actions, emotions, and thoughts attack the idea of self-love. The same way white blood cells attack a foreign pathogen. The idea here is that if you speak good words, then they will transform the perception you have of the reality you've built around you and inhabited. You can bet that Cain was cursing his brother from afar. when he saw his unaccepted sacrifice and then compared that to his brother's. There are 6 levels to one's individual perception of reality, and they are belief, thought, speech, emotions, actions, back to beliefs, because this is a cycle. As you can see here, speech lies right in the middle of the cycle. This structure. Speech is what balances these other things. They can influence the others. You could even say that the tongue is like Aaron. Yes, that's weird. I don't know who in their right mind would compare Aaron to a tongue, but it is what it is. And as we've discussed, the reason why Aaron was in the middle of the hierarchy was because he was the messenger. But he also made the golden calf. He lay on the balance between creation and destruction. Now that we've laid the foundation as to the meaning of speech, we can now move on to tyrannical states and how they work, because beliefs are what make up tyrannical states. Not only tyrannical states, but states in general. What makes up a state is the beliefs. For example, political parties stand for different things, and it's in the acting out of those beliefs. So, with that said, we're going to look at some examples throughout history of tyrannical states. Now, forgive me in advance if my history is a little off. I was never good at history. It was never my strong suit. I was never the best at history, but I gave it a good shot here. So we're going to dive into 3 examples: Hitler, communism, and 1984, because you can't not mention 1984 when talking about totalitarianism. You just can't. Well, that's got cold, but I'm not complaining. The first example, how Hitler rose to power. The Treaty of Versailles was a treaty mainly led by Britain, France, and the USA, which ended the First World War and would hold Germany accountable for all its allies for World War I. Germany suffered immensely throughout this period. They suffered so immensely they fell into a depression. They were ruined financially and filled with bitterness and frustration. The German people were starting to lose hope as to what would happen in the future. This is where Hitler and the Nazi Party came in. You could say that the German people had adopted the spirit of Cain. So when Hitler came along, he promised to end this depression. He was going to get the country back on its feet. People were going to get their jobs back. Hitler brought hope back to the hopeless. Carl Jung studied Hitler in a great deal, and the things he discovered were profound. So I'm going to use his teachings his studies as a reference point to uncover the mentality of Hitler, especially, not just Hitler, but a tyrant in general, but especially in Hitler's case, because he was so different. He was so different compared to the likes of Stalin and Mussolini, which makes him, he was more interesting. He had a different mindset. His mentality was different. He had different views and opinions and beliefs. So we're going to dive into him. Hitler's main tactic to get where he got to it's down to the fact that he became the embodiment of the German people's hopes, desires, and imagination. Hitler was well aware of what the German people wanted, so he decided to give it to them. That's how he got everyone on his side. And this is why people say that it was actually the German people who caused Hitler to become the man he became. Hitler was intelligent. He listened. He paid attention to what people wanted. He was aware. He was incredibly aware of the people around him. He studied crowds. He watched crowds carefully. Jung stated that Hitler was the archetypal hero. And not just any hero, but a religious hero, a savior, The German people looked at him as their only form of salvation from the inflicted sufferings caused by the treaty. Off topic, for those of you who don't know what the archetypal hero is, in storytelling, characters have archetypes. These are the character that sits behind the character, so to speak. Like, every character fills one of these roles in every story. And the archetypal hero is the character who faces evil. He faces evil, faces it, and brings some form of structure, some form of peace from willingly facing that evil. That's just a basic summary. You can study it for yourself, though. I lost my place. Yeah. They said that they thought that he was a hero. He was a savior. He was also quite explicit on the idea that Hitler had lost his individuality to the German nation, and that there is a simplistic description of a tyrannical state there. A tyrannical state is caused by the sacrifice of the self for the spirit of the state. When the individuality gets lost to the state is when things become dangerous, because you no longer have individuality. But what you do have is what the state says you have. You are what the state says you are. And what makes it so dangerous is that you look at Hitler and what he did. He himself got lost. He was a victim of that spirit. Did I just call Hitler a victim? Kinda. Because it shows here that he was not the enemy. The spirit was the enemy. He was just the face of the spirit. He became the face of the spirit of the nation. The face of that destructive, resentful spirit. So, and he was sacrificed to the state. He lost himself for the state. And that heavily suggests that he embodied the German people. He embodied the state. And that's what caused him to become who he became. It was a terrible tragedy. Hitler believed he was doing a good thing by sacrificing himself for his people. And we've spoken about the dangers of the wrong type of sacrifice. The German people, as a nation, had adopted the spirit of Cain. They were out for revenge. But that type of sacrifice can be seen as noble. To die for everyone for the betterment of the nation and the future. That's what Christ did. Hitler saw how fallen Germany had become and was horrified. But a better used word here would be disgust. Hitler was disgusted by what he saw. He was not ambiguous regarding his strong feelings of disgust, and it was by taking on the burden of the nation that Hitler destined to bring forth a purer Germany, a better Germany all around. This is how Hitler fills the role of the hero. The hero is the character who carries the heavy burden of his people and does it willingly to bring forth a better future for his kingdom. And he was willing to do that no matter the cost, which again brings us back to the vengeful, hateful, and bloodlusty spirit of Cain that had possessed the German nation. It was this ideal that inspired Hitler, along with his strong feelings of disgust, that inspired him to do what he did. But remember, Hitler was an artist. He was a creative. He was a dreamer. And these characteristics merged with hatred and disgust brought forth Hitler's radical and dark motives for change. By Hitler bringing forth a form of paradise, he had to shed a mountain of blood. He had to shed blood to do it, because the only way he could do it was by ridding the world of all evil. But as we have discussed, what you believe in most is your ideal, that's your God. And the German people, along with the Nazi Party, had all become one spirit, one ideal, one belief, which is what makes this a form of tyranny. Everyone working together as a collective to bring forth the ideal, to the point where one's individuality, the spirit of the self, has been sacrificed for the spirit of the state. Jung went as far to say that when Hitler took on the beliefs of the state, the German people, he actually became possessed. Odin, that was it. Odin. Wotan is Odin in Norse mythology, but who cares? We as believers can just take that and replace it with the Antichrist. Spirit of destruction. We know that when the Antichrist is allowed upon the earth, he will bring peace and claim that he is God. In a way, that's what Hitler did in his own mind. He brought forth peace to the German people, which was soon to be revealed as complete hell. There seems to be a running idea here, a running theme, and the theme is paradise. A false idea of paradise, because from an outside perspective, we know that what Hitler did was far from paradise, but was in fact purely evil. It's a lie. This idea of paradise is predicated on a lie, because look at all the suffering and evil that is built upon. Let's look at the Holocaust. For example, Hitler saw the German people. Hitler saw the Jewish people as the epitome of vermin. Therefore, the extermination of the entire Jewish nation would bring forth a better world to Hitler. The genocide of the Jews was a mercy. In order to bring forth this vision of a better world, Hitler had in mind, and the most noble thing the Jewish people could do was give their lives to bring forth the perfect world. This is how Hitler rose to power and managed to bring forth the catastrophic evil that he did. Before we move on, I should have written this down. But what we're saying here, you sacrifice yourself for the state. It blurs the lines. Now, I'm not speaking blasphemy here, so hold on. It blurs the lines between tyranny and Christ. Because you take the tyranny away, you have the body of Christ. You are a member of the body. You are no longer your old self. The old self is gone. It's been sacrificed for something greater. So, terrifying truth, the golden calf all over again. You better make sure that if you're going to sacrifice yourself for something, it's the right thing. And only God is the right thing. Otherwise it falls through. And another thing. What makes heaven a paradise is free will. We're going to speak here a lot about paradise. These people here believed they got it right. They believed they solved all the world's problems, so we did it. That's it. But it's a lie. And you can't speak up against that paradise because you're the bad one if you do. You deserve to be punished. That's what makes heaven a paradise. It's free will. It's the perfect place. But you don't have to be there if you don't want to be there. You're not forced to enjoy this perfect place. You're not forced to live there. You're not forced to be a part of it. You're not forced. You have free will. If you don't want to go there, then that's your choice. At the end of the day, that's your choice. So let's move on to the rise of the Soviet Union. The rise of the Soviet Union happened at the cost of one man in particular. Okay, make your weird noises. Karl Marx, who was a German philosopher and a revolutionist. I can't read that without giggling. Revolutionist. Karl Marx came up with the idea of socialism. There doesn't seem to be much of a difference regarding socialism and communism, because Marx used the two terms rather interchangeably. But what exactly is communism? In a communist state, people are not divided by class. It's one for all and all for one. You probably heard people making jokes about communism when someone says, "Oh, my this, that," and they're like, "No, ours." According to the rules of communism, no one is allowed to have free ownership because there is no division of class. Everyone is equal, despite who they are or what they do for the development of the state. Everyone is equal, which means there's no individuality, according to the state. That's what makes communism totalitarian, because there is no individuality. Everyone is the same. The spirit of the state has been forced upon the Russian people, and we see that demonstrated when Stalin ordered the construction of the gulags. Anyone who refused to conform to their utopia would vainly be worked to death. So that leads us to the question, how did things get like this? The Germans had invaded Russia, and the Russian people were starving to death. Starvation was the biggest killer of the Russian people at the time, which led to the overthrowing of the Russian monarchy, which started the Civil War. The Soviets surrendered to the Germans, and it was after the Battle of Warsaw that many Soviet republicans united to form the USSR, where shortly after its rise, its former leader would die, and Joseph Stalin would take his place. The biggest problem with Marx's ideology is that it glorifies nihilism. Marx was giving the weak, dangerous, and hedonistic the right to inflict their vengeful fantasies on the world. Take what happened to the kulaks as a prime example. It was one of the first things the Soviet revolutionists did. They wanted to and did tear down anyone who was more successful than they were. So they started with the kulaks, which was the name given to the successful peasants who owned the farms and made a rather abundant living off the land. Revolutionists wanted rid of these people because how dare they live a more successful life than the communists? So the response of the Union was to round up these successful farmers and throw them in the gulags. It's this kind of ideology that brings forward the weak, the violent, the destructive, and the vengeful, but more specifically, the victims. Again, we can look towards Cain, who hauntingly and explicitly conveyed the dangers of the victim ideology. The victim ideology, or more appropriately, Marxism, they go against what these stories have been aiming to teach us from the beginning, which is to pursue God above all else, despite the sufferings that come with that pursuit. This seems to be the main reason as to how the story of the Tower of Babel is a juxtaposition to the story of the flood. Noah pursued God. Noah pursued God despite the destruction and the suffering that came with. He didn't drown. Noah didn't drown. He pursued God above all else, despite having every reason not to. And he didn't drown. Nimrod and all his servants decided to aim downwards. Cain decided to aim toward hell. And look how that turned out. It's ironic because it's for this exact reason that everyone who was involved in the construction of the tower drowned, meaning they had fallen into this pursuit of hell. Marxism teaches that it's okay to be a victim, that being swept away by the flood is to be glorified. And when one becomes a victim, then one is entitled to a life in the garden, a life of paradise, just because. The most catastrophic problem with this ideology is that when one adopts the identity of the victim, then they have bought the biggest lie the devil can sell. I've mentioned this before, and it's that you are a child of circumstance. Because when one adopts the identity of the victim, then nothing can change. It's the belief that this event is the be-all and end-all of one's existence. Nothing will ever get better from this moment forth, which allows this event to hang over you like a Lovecraftian monster, dictating your every move, shaping every perspective you have of the world around you, which brings us back to that idea that your highest belief is what you bow down to and serve. Yeah, it's right. It's only right I do this. And that's apologize if I have showed any feelings of animosity. Did I say that right? Animosity, animosity towards suffering. Because look, I'm not disregarding your suffering. The flood takes us all. At some point in life, we're gonna face the flood. We're gonna be hit, we're gonna be crushed, we're gonna be destroyed. It happens to all of us. So I'm not saying that your suffering isn't valid. I'm not saying that you're not entitled to feel the suffering and to acknowledge it and to heal from it. I'm not saying that. Because things get bad. Life is hard. Life can just crush you down and 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 then crush you down. It can destroy you. So don't take me up here as some perfect guy who's got it all together, because no. Don't. I'm not judging. I'm not judging. But what I am saying is that the floods of life come from God. And the difference lies between those who seek growth and those who seek destruction. When that eldritch terror lurks over your head, it's when things are at their worst because you can't see the thing. But when you give the thing an identity, a name, and you humanize the suffering and choose to face it, then you understand that this thing can be overcome. I personally found this to be quite useful during 7 years of suicidal ideation. At the time, I had no clue of spiritual warfare. But the imagery of the demonic helped. The fact that this demon had decided to take shelter in the corner of my room, and that it's dedicated its entire existence to tracking me down, proves two things. This is not a part of me, and this is not my friend. It dedicates its life to ending yours. So there has to be a separation between the two, because you'll never overcome. If your identity is in the problem, then you'll never find the solution. If the devil can get you to identify with the problem, then your identity is out of Christ. You're not looking at God anymore. You're focusing on the problem. That's how he gets you. So there has to be a separation. There has to be a separation to you and the suffering. Otherwise, that spirit becomes adopted into your identity and you become the suffering, which leads to Cain. You embody the spirit of Cain, the adoption of the spirit of Satan himself, or itself. I don't know. It's a constant downward aim that leads to revenge, and the revolutionists believed that due to this suffering they were entitled to a life in the Garden of Eden, a life of paradise, so they can take whatever they want just because. But we know that human beings were not designed for paradise, which makes this a vain pursuit, which will always result in a downward spiral, which will always result as the final destination being hell. This is why the Soviet Union was so incredibly dangerous. It was a form of hell on earth, grounded on the idea that stripping away individual identity and living as one body was the perfect form of paradise. Let's move on to our last example. 1984. Orwell's classic novel, 1984, which is set in England after England lost the Second World War, that's devastating to think about. Imagine Nazi England, Soviet England. That's scary. That's scary. That's scary. So can we just take a moment to honor those soldiers who fought the Nazis, who fought the Russians, who stopped them in their tracks? The British soldiers who didn't back down to Hitler's army, who killed the Nazis. Because life would be different. So I give my thanks. In the story of 1984, England has been taken over the political party Big Brother. Now, it's never explicitly told to us if Big Brother represents the Nazis or the Soviets, but one could argue that Big Brother represents both, or one could lead towards the latter, due to INSOC, which is short for English socialism. Our protagonist is a man named Winston Smith who works for Big Brother. The thing with Big Brother is that everything they say is a lie. The story is set in London. It's become a part of the state Oceania. Everything that can be consumed has become a form of propaganda, which is constantly being renewed and changed. Everything they say is a lie. But what this story is most famous for, and you've probably heard it being referenced and mentioned, is how Big Brother constantly watches its people. There are cameras everywhere. There's even a TV show inspired by it. I know there's a UK version, and I think there's a US version. Big Brother, where all the people live in the house as a social experiment. And the logo is the eye. They watch you. It's based on this. Now you know. Nobody's allowed freedom. Free speech has become a crime. To conceive a thought that is that isn't in alignment or against Big Brother is punishable by death. Everything everyone says or does is monitored heavily. Big Brother has broken down the citizens of London with lies, confusion, and propaganda to the point where they have been stripped of all individuality and become what Big Brother has envisioned. Their thoughts and beliefs have become what Big Brother wants them to think and believe. That was weak. There is a rather prolonged section of the book when Winston gets a hold of a book regarding the truth of Oceania for someone he managed to get in touch with. I'm not going to go into too much detail for those who haven't read it, but I would highly recommend it. Highly recommend reading it. Oceania is grounded upon lies and fear. Not only does the fear stem from Big Brother, but from the citizens themselves, because everyone is too afraid to talk about one another. Again, what makes a totalitarian state is when the individual is sacrificed for the spirit of the state, which is why the citizens of the state are fearful to talk to each other, because you never know if you're talking to an actual human being or a product of the state. A real life example of this would be North Korea. Everyone's kept in place by fear. Just think what could happen in North Korea if everyone put fear to one side. The nation would be overthrown with the spirit of truth. You even think Kim Jong-un, personally, I've had conversations with people in life. It's always been like, maybe he's scared. Maybe he's too afraid to talk. Maybe he's too afraid to change. Even the soldiers are afraid to speak out against each other because they don't know who's who. Something similar happened with the Soviet army. Friends turned on friends on the front lines. Soldiers were sent out to fight, and whoever turned back would be shot by their own friend. Now that we have looked over multiple examples and fundamentally understand what makes a tyrannical state, we can now attempt to answer the question at the beginning, which was, why was Nimrod given the judgment he was given? How is his punishment just? So let's dive into the conclusion. There are two things all the examples we've looked at have in common. Firstly, all these states seem to be predicated on the idea that they have achieved paradise. They have managed to bring forth a utopia where all the world's problems have been solved. But as we know, this is a lie. That's the first trait they all share, a lie. They are founded upon a lie. Secondly, all these states were governed and motivated by fear. Fear is what kept everyone in place, and not just the citizens, but the leaders themselves. There comes a point in time where things have gone on for too long, and you reach a point of no return. This seems to be true in Hitler's case. He himself was an embodiment of the tyranny that governed Germany. Now we understand exactly what makes a tyrannical state, and those two things are a lie and fear. A society is everyone working together to bring forth the ideal future. The belief most believed in, but with a balance. This is fundamentally how democracy works. There is free speech. People are allowed to keep their individuality. People can disagree on certain beliefs and topics. There is an extent to the amount of sacrificing of self one has to do in order to be deemed value to the society. For example, one could not be filled with rage and contempt, proceed to commit a heinous act of some sort, and blame it on society for its lack of acceptance. This is the fundamental difference between a democratic state and a tyrannical state. One offers the gift of individuality, with the biggest threat being that you can overthrow the gift. That's the biggest problem with democracy. If everyone has free speech, you might just be opening yourself up to the possibility of democracy being taken off the table altogether. Now we fully understand what Genesis 1:11 means when it says that everybody was of one speech. They had all been overcome with the tyrannical spirit. They had all lost their individuality to the tyrannical spirit of rebellion. Because that's what the Tower of Babel was. It was a rebellion against God. Nimrod shook his fist at God and said, "We don't need you. We can get to heaven ourselves. We can build our own paradise." Well, he didn't actually say that, but his actions spoke that. This is the first tyrannical state. This is the lie, a false paradise. The second reason they built this tower was so that if God ever decided to flood the earth again, then they would be safe. This is the second trait of a tyrannical state, the fear. It's also worth mentioning here that it's believed the tower was a ziggurat. Am I saying that right? A ziggurat structure, which is almost a pyramid shape. While others believe it to be more circular. Whatever way you look at it, whether it be a ziggurat or a more circular structure, they have one commonality, and that's they resemble the shape of a Christmas tree. Excuse me. A structure with a large base decreases in width with the increase of height. Which brings up something random. I know, why are we talking about Christmas trees within this context? I'm about to upset some of you. The reason being is that Christmas is a celebration of Nimrod. It was Nimrod who was born on December 25th, not Christ. Jeremiah 10 verse 3-4 says this: "For the customs of people are vain, for one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold, they fasten it with nails, with hammers, that it move not." This just so happens to bring us to our next point. At the start of Jeremiah 10, God was instructing the Israelites to be set apart and to not follow the heathen. Which asks the question, what is to be done about the tyrannical state? Let's say you were an Israelite who had just been taken to Babylon. What would you do? How would you react? The answers lie in the book of Jeremiah also. God said to the people of Israel that they were to become a part of the Babylonian people. They were to plant vineyards, take up houses, and they were to integrate into their society, but they were not to bow down to their ways. And this can be seen being demonstrated perfectly in the book of Daniel. When Daniel went on a 10-day fast and mainly ate vegetables, he let no meat which was custom to the Babylonian diet pass his lips. By doing this, Daniel was drawing the line in the sand between himself and the Babylonians. And it was through Daniel's steadfast faith in God that all the kings of Babylon come to understand that Daniel's God was the true God. All the kings, there was Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the rising from the candlestick, and even Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. But at the end of all these things did the kings of Babylon come to understand that their gods were not truth. It was through continuing truth that the lies of Babylon were revealed. Which brings us back to the Tower of Babel. The reason why the tower is called Babel is due to what God did. That's where we get the phrase babbling on from. If you're babbling, then you're talking nonsense. So God confused them all, which means they were not able to communicate with each other, and the progression of the tower had been stopped. So they were all one spirit, one speech, one body, one goal, one idea. God confused them, causing a separation, which means that the ideal had been struck down. The tower had to be stopped. That's how God did it. They were not able to communicate with each other. Their beliefs, their goals, their speeches, they weren't in alignment. So no one could communicate with each other. Therefore, the progression of the tower had to be stopped. And in the end, everyone went their own way. They went forth and multiplied the earth according to God's will. Daniel and God took down Babylon in the same way. This brings us to the conclusion of the Tower of Babel. That was it. The reason why God confused everyone was because Nimrod's judgment was humiliation, shame. His pride was turned to humility. I like to joke that God was kind of having a practical joke with Nimrod. It's like that, you know that scene in the Karate Kid 2, where Mr. Miyagi and what's his name? Kreese. It was Kreese. Where Mr. Miyagi and Kreese get into a fight, and because of the second one picks up just after the first one, right? It picks up from where the first one left off, and they're in the parking lot and they're having this fight, and John Kreese is going bam both his fists, and he puts his fist through glass because Mr. Miyagi's just like, and then he gets him on his knees, and he goes to cut off his hair supply. He's just like, and then Daniel asks him afterwards, hey, why did you do that? And he says, some things are worse than death. He didn't kill him. He just humiliated him. He took him down. He humbled him. He took him down a peg or two. That's kind of what God did here. He just made fun of Nimrod. He just ruined him in a really, really simple, silly way. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed. I prayed you were edified and that you have a better understanding of the Tower of Babel now, because it's a weird one. So I pray that you were edified, and I pray that you understand now, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time and attention, as always. Excuse me. I appreciate you. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I'm thankful that you're here. By the way, have you noticed that I changed things up? I wear a lot of red and black. I was like, change it up. And grey was the best I could do. Grey was the best I could do. So yeah. When it comes to the ministry, sow some seeds. And we encourage you to sow by liking, subscribing, sharing, doing all that stuff, because it's seed. You're sowing a seed. It's the most you can do right now. And I'm thankful for everyone. I'm thankful for you all. I appreciate you all. So thank you for watching. God bless you. We'll pick up with the Abrahamic stories, which I have been struggling with a little bit, but I've gotten there pretty much. So I'll leave you with this. I'll see you when I see you, but I'll leave you with this. The Tower of Babel was the first tyrannical state. So how do you bring down and stop the progression of the tyrannical state? Tell the truth.